Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue. Got a new video series showcasing both Octane and V-Ray within MODO. Initially, I'm going to be focusing on materials, so I'm going to be focusing on specific materials that you would use in something like product rendering. Plastics, metals, glass, subsurface materials. We're going to be doing two things with them. One, we're going to create a material in the MODO shader tree using the standard MODO shader material node, for instance, like a gold metallic material. And we're going to see how both Octane and V-Ray translate that material on the fly into the respective renderers. And then I'm going to recreate that material using Octane and V-Ray specific nodes and see if we can get a little more quality out of that using the specific features that each of those renderers have. So it's going to take a while to get through this. I have to do some initial render setup in terms of lighting and GI and some things like that, some other settings between the three programs, sort of even them out, and that's what the first video is going to be showcasing. And then we're going to move on to materials from there. So it's going to take a while to get through all of this. Be patient. Go grab a beer or a juice box, whatever, whatever is age appropriate for you, and relax, and let's get on with the show here. All right, let's break this scene down really quickly. In the middle here, we have a Pixel Fondue shader ball with a white plastic material on it, 0.8 on the diffuse color, 100% diffuse amount, 4% specular amount, so 4% reflection on the facing angles, well 100% Fresnel amount, so 100% reflection on the glancing angles, white specular color, and a 15% roughness. So keep your eye on roughness because roughness varies between all three programs quite a bit. And then for lighting, we have a couple of area lights in the scene. There's sort of a key area light here, look at the top, key area light, and a fill area light. Both are just pure white, and they're providing some illumination and some reflection sources in the scene. And then, of course, I do have a soft tint. This image here, I actually made this a number of years ago. It comes with MODO, an HDR image to sort of fill in the, it's basically a neutral fill light with some reflections. That's why I like to use it. So it's a very neutral scene. We're just trying to, get a gist for the differences between the renderers and the materials. So let's jump in and do that. So right off the bat, here's the standard MODO preview, and I just let it run for 30 seconds or so, and you see the nice white plastic. You see a reflection of that key area light there. There's some reflections on the stainless steel metal and some secondary reflections down here on the bottom of the sphere. It's sort of a matte metallic, a black matte metallic material on the burner. Pretty noisy underneath. You can keep your eye on that too. Depth of field is active, so you can see the depth of field on the grid behind it. Keep in mind the grid is an image. It's not a procedural texture, so that's an image, and the Pixel Fondue logo is an image. And you can see like the another area light reflection right there, the fill and the Pixel Fondue logo, and it's kind of dim, but you can see the HDR reflecting in there as well. So that's that. So let's just say that's my product. It's got some plastic materials on it. It's got some an HDR lighting. It's got some area lights. And I want to render it in V-Ray. So I come over here to V-Ray RT. And I've got two options in V-Ray RT. I can do the RT, the real-time rendering, with the CPU or with the GPU. And I have separate RT settings for both. I did adjust these a little bit. They're really just vanilla settings. I upped the trace depth to 8 because that's what MODO is, and the GI down from 3 to 2. I think trace maybe started at 5. Default and just 3 instead of 2 GI depth. So I just adjusted those so it more matches MODO. Octane actually has vastly more bounces of depth for both of these, but we'll get to Octane in a minute. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and say go with the CPU. So my little arrow here, I can press and hold. I've got a green start GPU or a white start CPU. Let's just start with the CPU. So it loads the scene into V-Ray. It does an on-the-fly translation of this white plastic material and this matte black metal material and the stainless steel material into V-Ray equivalent materials. But what you'll notice, really, right off the bat, is it kind of looks just like the MODO render. So you can get a V-Ray render using the CPU version of RT, very similar to the MODO render right off the bat. Now, there are limitations, of course. V-Ray doesn't support all of MODO's procedurals, but it does come with a lot of its own procedurals, like a ton of them. It also will support a number of MODO things like gradients and some of the gradient inputs. So you can do some gradient work in MODO, and that will translate over to V-Ray CPU, but not necessarily GPU. The GPU in V-Ray has all kinds of limitations. They're obviously working on that, and in each version of V-Ray, there's fewer and fewer limitations, but there are limitations, and they're documented over on the V-Ray side. So the V-Ray GPU renderer won't render even all V-Ray materials or V-Ray textures correctly as well. So I'm just going to pause. In fact, I'll hit the stop button here. And what I'm going to do is turn on limited region rendering, and I've got half of it selected. I'm going to restart this RT render, this side of it at least, using V-Ray's GPU renderer. So there we go on the green, hit go. And it, again, loads the geometry and everything into the GPU, in addition to, again, doing an on-the-fly translation of the MODO materials. And you'll notice that it clears up very quickly. This is a dual processor Xeon system with 16 cores, so 32 with hyperthreading, but the original Titan and second generation Tesla are just way faster. So that's basically clear just in 10 seconds or so. But it's not particularly correct. There is something I noticed while doing this, and that is the depth of field on the GPU render is not correct. Here it's very clear in the back where we get blurry depth of field in the CPU renderer and blurry depth of field in the MODO renderer. Yet in the foreground, I'm getting what looks to me like a depth of field blurring in the GPU renderer, but not in the CPU renderer or in the MODO renderer. So something's up with depth of field in the V-Ray GPU renderer, at least as far as I can tell. And this may be documented or already bugged on the V-Ray site. I didn't check. It's just something I noticed while making the tutorial. I'll make sure to let people know. But so assume a fix is coming, or maybe I screwed something up. But just hitting go, there is a problem with depth of field. Other than that, the V-Ray GPU and CPU renders look equivalent, which is great because the GPU render in V-Ray right now is really only set up as a real-time preview device, although you could conceivably render stills with it, and there might be a command line way to render animations. But it's really meant for working and getting your materials correct, and then you render similar to MODO with V-Ray and the offline CPU renderer. Okay, so we've got this. I'm going to actually turn off the render region and just let it wrap up the GPU renderer here, give it a few seconds, so then we can compare it to Octane in just 1 second here. And really, we're now 10 seconds in, and it's looking pretty good. So GPUs are fast. And I have dual Titan X's in a different machine at the office here, and imagine this twice as fast as what I just showed. And those are Maxwell version Titan X's, so you can imagine the new Titan XPs, maybe even 1.5 to twice as fast again. So GPUs are just very, very fast. All right, I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to come over here to Octane and hit render, and we'll see what goes on. Boom, hit render. It's got to load the stuff, the geometry and textures into the Octane renderer, and then into the GPU, and then get going. And so right off the bat, something looks amiss, right? It's all blown out. It's all dark. It's all weird. Something's not right. And so the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at the environment. And the Octane renderer, generally by default, even if you have an HDR in the MODO environment section, tends to default to the daylight environment, the physically based sky that Octane has. It's a nice sky, it's a nice physically based sky, but we don't want that. So we need to change that to the textured environment, which is going to use that soft tint HDR image I showed earlier. So hit that, and that looks different. Okay, interesting. I can see the reflection of the HDR in there now, but there's a couple of things still wrong. One, it looks very dim, and it almost looks like it has a bit of a greenish almost cast to it. I have pretty good color acuity, and actually, you know what? Along those lines, V-Ray looks a little warmer to me than MODO. MODO looks a little cooler and bluer even than V-Ray, but there's something definitely wrong with Octane. You don't have to have good color acuity to notice that something's up. So we need to look at the imager in the camera icon here. So we bring up the camera icon, we have an imager. And in Octane, there's something called a response or response curve. And this just kind of drives me nuts, actually, because it defaults to, what it does is it simulates different films. And honestly, V-Ray can do this too with lookup tables. So LUTs, it could probably has all of these in various LUTs you can download and just use these in V-Ray. But it doesn't do it by default because nobody in their right mind would do this by default. You want it neutral by default. And then if you choose to pick one of these artistic, filmy response curves, then you can do that. And it's really pretty awesome that, Octane does this real time. It just, changes it as a post-process. But we don't want these. So there's a couple of options here. One, and I may be wrong about this, but I think I'm right. Is this the default one? I think it's this one here. If you hit neutral response, it'll do one of two things, but it'll essentially, it's not applying the RGB tinting, the color tinting to the response curve. I lost that green tint, but it's still applying the gamma correction of the curve. This has still been gamma corrected. This is not a linear image. And what we want to do is we want to make this a linear image, just like MODO was a linear image that has an sRGB LUT applied to it, and V-Ray also was a linear image with this little button down here is the sRGB LUT. So if I click that there, that is linear now in V-Ray. If I go over here to Octane, I turn off neutral response, and I just turn the response to linear / off. We're now linear in Octane and linear in V-Ray. In fact, I can go linear in MODO as well. So if I just go to linear here and unpause it, unfortunately MODO starts preview over when you change the LUT, which seems like you don't have to do that, Foundry. Seems like it should just be able to do that in real time like everybody else. So it's unfortunate, but MODO starts the preview over when you change the LUT. That being said, you can see that these are all very similar again, right? MODO and V-Ray look very similar as a linear image. V-Ray does have the depth of field issue with the GPU version here, but it looks very similar. And of course, we can fix these all by changing the LUT. In V-Ray, now V-Ray has all these freaking buttons everywhere. And when I first started using it, I was like, oh my God, look at all these buttons. This definitely came from 3D Studio Max. And kind of annoyed me, but you figure them out really quickly. Most of these down here deal with post-processing effects, like turning the sRGB LUT back on, or adding whatever custom LUT you want, or looking at pixel aspect ratio or stereo imaging, or adding bloom and glare effects or some other color post-processing operations. Octane can do a lot of that too. MODO can and has some of that stuff, but not nearly as much. So let's put MODO back to the sRGB LUT. Looks good. Looks just like V-Ray over here. Let that render for just 1 second. And then looking over at Octane, let's go in here to our camera imager again. We have it linear, which is great, but we need to bump that gamma up. And so the gamma for the sRGB LUTs in both MODO and V-Ray is 2.2, or approximately 2.2. So we go to 2.2, we have linear off. We'll notice that we're getting closer, but we're still missing something. We're missing the area light. So we don't have this area light highlight here or right here. You see right here, we're missing it. We're missing it on the Pixel Fondue logo here. We're missing that square. So area lights are not coming through. And Octane is a physically based render, a purely physically based render, pseudo-physically based render maybe. It doesn't recognize traditional 3D lights, so it doesn't recognize an area light. We need to convert that area light into something Octane recognizes. So I'm going to close my imager here, and now that I've made these changes, one last change actually, vignetting is on by default in Octane. Again, that's one of those things where it's simulating a camera. A vignette and a camera is really just an effect on the film because the camera lens housing is, obscuring part of the lens or obscuring at least part of the light that comes in, so you get a bit of a vignette around the edges. I don't know why that's on by default again. It seems like that should be off. And you see that brightened up a little bit when I turn that off. So we have the imager set up in a proper way now to simulate MODO and V-Ray, but we need to do something with the area lights. So we could do that really quickly. Octane really makes that pretty painless. And keep in mind, I'm taking 5 minutes to show you how to do this, but you could do it all in like 30 seconds. So select this area light here. You notice that in the properties, you have a create Octane emitter under this Octane light dropdown. Click that. It's going to do two things. It's going to, number one, it's going to create geometry that matches the area light, and it's going to parent it to the area light. So if I look at the area light over here, it now has a polygon stuck to it, and you'll see it right there. That polygon has a mask, and it has a Octane Override in it. That Octane Override creates an assembly in MODO. You can actually go up and see the assembly here. Key area light emitter. Click that. And this is an Octane diffuse material. We'll get into Octane materials in a moment, but this is a diffuse material with an emitter, an emission texture with a white color on the emission texture with a power of 2, which is going to match my area light's radiance. So basically, we stuck a polygon in there with a texture, a material on it, that's going to simulate that area light. And we're going to do the same thing to the other one. Boom. Done. Does it really fast. It tells me I need to refresh, but that's really from an older version of the Octane plugin, I believe, because without refreshing, let me just close that to move this out of the way. I didn't refresh, it just updated on its own. So Octane, you don't have to constantly refresh Octane like some people seem to think. It does a good job of updating on its own. So that's all looking pretty good. I got my reflection here, my reflection here, my reflection here. The matte black metal's looking good. The stainless steel's looking good. But this background grid texture is still blown out. And what is that about? So that has to do with gamma correction. And I'm not going to get into an entire dialogue on what gamma correction is. If you don't know what it is and what linear workflow is, you need to look that up because it's very important. Maybe I'll do another video on that. Right now, if I look at MODO system preferences, MODO has something called OCIO. It's an open color IO. Standard, it's from Nuke, or it's in Nuke at least, and a number of other programs. Basically what that does is, when I bring in a texture map, like this blue and white grid texture, and it's an 8-bit ping, MODO sees that and says, okay, my default behavior is to say this 8-bit ping here has a color space of sRGB, which is correct. And so what MODO is going to do, sort of behind the scenes, is invert that gamma or compensate for it so MODO can render in a linear fashion, get a linear image, like that dim image I showed earlier, a linear image right here. That's a linear image in V-Ray. And then it applies this gamma correction, this sRGB LUT or lookup table afterwards to bring up the midtones, all the values between black and white. All this has to do with the fact that if everything was always linear and looked like this, it looks too dim to us humans. So linear math going from calculations to a rendered image or a TV image to a display device, or even video recording to a display device, results in a dim image. So we bump up the midtones. We call that a gamma correction. So happy Homo sapiens like us can say, hey, that looks good, instead of, that looks like shit, I can hardly see anything. That's essentially what's going on here. So we're compensating for that. And this obviously has not been compensated. Octane is not looking at those OCIO settings in MODO, or if it is, it's not looking at them properly. Or actually, it may be actually a little bit too complicated. There are circumstances where you don't want an image to be color corrected with the OCIO standards. You may want like a normal map image. You don't want to do a gamma correction on that. You just want the straight values. So, you know, it gets complicated, but you know, programs are doing the best they can. We don't have to do a lot of things manually anymore. But unfortunately, we do have to do this manually now with Octane. And it's actually pretty easy. I just select my plane mask. There's my image here, just to make sure, you know, we see that it's set to default, which is that sRGB thing. It's not being picked up by Octane. So I'm going to add an Octane Override. So under Custom Materials, I add an Octane Override. What that's going to do is it's going to convert this entire material in the mask to the equivalent Octane material, create an assembly in the schematic, and bring that up for me to edit. So boom, boom, boom. I have my Octane Override. I can edit this in the schematic. Here it is. There's my override. Here's my glossy material. There's three types of materials in Octane: a diffuse, a specular, and a glossy. We'll get into these later. And here's my image right here going into my image node. My image node has, let me just move these out of the way so we can see what's going on here. My image node, whoops, that's always annoying. My image node has a gamma channel and a power channel. So if I adjust the gamma channel from 1 to 2.2, I lose that blown out look on the grid, and it looks more similar to MODO and V-Ray. Now it's not exact, and I can adjust the power level as well, but you have to keep in mind, these are very different algorithms being used in V-Ray and MODO and Octane. And any sort of conversion between channels like roughness or emissive values or even color or specular values is their best approximation for this on-the-fly conversion. So you may have to go in there and be an artist a little bit, and maybe I adjust the power of this a little bit, or I could even go in and adjust the exposure, because this whole thing's just a little bit brighter than these two. And you can do that in Octane in real time. I can just, you know, knock the exposure down a little bit like I would in a real camera, maybe 0.95, and I'm getting closer to that V-Ray and MODO level there. So that's the gist of it, how it works. And before I move on to other materials like metals and subsurface scattering materials, let's take a look at a V-Ray specific material and an Octane specific material for this white plastic and see how we can recreate that material and what those channels, those V-Ray and Octane specific channels do and how they relate to their MODO counterparts.
Yum, yum!